And I'm going to start this section by asking you guys a question. Are you a good person? Yeah, sometimes. I mean, we all like to think of ourselves as being a good person, but what does it mean to be a good person? Okay, thoughts, morals, actions all align with some notion of virtue. What are those notions? What do good people do? They help others, they don't hurt others, or even people they love, or just people, maybe people they don't love. They're willing to sacrifice their own interest in the name of some ideal. They're willing to, contribute to a collective good. We all have these notions of what good is. And now, for a long time when I thought about what it meant to be a good person, those just seem like self-evident facts. We just think that, oh, good is good. It comes from some natural order, or maybe it comes from God in some ways. And for a long, long time, that's basically, people thought good was just, what was good was kind of a self-evident proposition. And then this guy came along. So Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosopher from the late 19th, early 20th century, and he fundamentally upended how we think about good and morality. Once you read Nietzsche, it's not easy to sort of see the world in the same way again. He's just one of those kinds of writers. Nietzsche's also difficult because he offers us a lot of really transgressive ideas that really push up against our common sense notions of what good is and what ethics are. It doesn't help that he's often seen as an apologist for like incels and sociopaths and Nazis. But Nietzsche was none of those things. He's just a really, really multi-layered and provocative thinker. And I want to just talk about one of his ideas here because I think it's really interesting to this question of language and ordering the self. And it goes to what we think of as good. And in the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche's probably most celebrated work, he comes up with this observation, which is that if you want to know how morality evolves over time, look at language. And his basic thesis here is that morality is not something that comes from a natural order. It's not something that's just self-evidently bestowed to us. Morality is something that we construct to control other people. And it's a mechanism of power, and it's a mechanism of power politics. And he spells out this thesis by looking at the evolution of language. So if you look in a lot of different language in sort of the pre-Christian notion, say, take the term good, of what good is. Good generally denotes something that has power and strength to it. In the way that we would say, that's a good horse, or that's a good sword. Think about this Aristotelian idea of what a good hammer was, we were talking about last week. It's something that's really fulfilling its function in a really, really strong way. And the reason why good had this meaning, because good was also what the aristocratic classes used to describe themselves. Good meant power. It meant power and dominance in the human scheme. Bad, on the other hand, was a term that the aristocratic classes used to describe the underlings, the serfs, the slaves. It meant, subjugation, abnegation, disempowerment, weakness. After the rise of Christianity in the West, you see a shift in these meanings and terms. What used to be considered good, now, like power, dominance, self-assertion, those begin to be considered bad, or worse, even evil. Whereas terms that used to be considered bad, or qualities that used to be considered bad, like weak, meekness, subjugation, begin to be elevated as something that's good. And you could see this in, for example, let's go back and look at the Iliad compared to the Gospels. In the Iliad, you look at Odysseus, Achilles, all of the heroes of the Iliad are brutal killers. They're conniving, they steal, they rape. What makes them good is their martial prowess, their capacity for power, and their craftiness. Go forward to the Gospels and you see Jesus Christ. And Jesus is good by his meekness, his willingness to, accept punishment on behalf of his followers, his willingness to be crucified. This idea that the meek shall inherit the earth. Or, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. He's heroic in his gentleness and his subjugation. And what Nietzsche suggests is this came from a shift in the power dynamics of the society at the time. What he called the priestly classes were those people who had some knowledge but didn't have a lot of power. And if you're someone with knowledge and without power, and you want to sort of gain the upper hand in any kind of political contest, what you need to do is reframe the terms of the debate. You need to basically reshape how people are understanding what's legitimate and what's illegitimate. So basically the priests come in and they tell the military leaders and the kings, yes, you are not good because of your power. You are not good because you can have violence over others. In fact, that makes you bad. What makes you good is your meekness, your subjugation. And he says, basically what happened in this time, we switched from a noble morality, which was based on physical coercion and power, to a slave morality, which was elevated notions of meekness and good. And we see this all the times around us. Every moment of politics, you see people trying to elevate or make their own moral status, and particularly oftentimes their victimization, as a way to gain a moral upper hand. Here's a great example of it. The bad man broke my little arm. My kids love to say that. We used to have this joke about this. Oh, whenever one of them was sort of claiming some sort of victim status, oh, the bad man broke my little arm. And Nietzsche says that this is actually a big problem for us. Yes, it enables us to maybe bring allies into our fights, maybe by claiming, some sort of victim status, and we are able to ennoble ourselves relative to this one dimension of kind of what he would say is a slave morality. But he says it's actually corrosive for our character. He says, whereas old noble morality grows out of a triumphant saying yes to itself, slave morality says no, on principle, to everything that is outside, other, and non-self. How do we go about interpreting this? How do we interpret what Nietzsche says here? Because Nietzsche is challenging kind of the bedrock assumptions of who we are. And we might want to say, well, we want to know everything is good. That's what keeps our social order together. That's what keeps people peaceful. I don't want other people lording and dominating over me. I don't want them making claims to that. And Nietzsche would acknowledge that. But I think he might say, well, what are you doing to stand up for yourself? And what are the means that you're standing up for yourself? And if you're standing up for yourself by then wrapping yourself in the blanket of your own victimization, what you're ultimately doing is abnegating yourself. You're abnegating your own authenticity as a being. Now, Nietzsche locates all of this in the West and in the evolution of the Judeo-Christian ethic. And I think there's a lot of interesting ideas that he has within that, and particularly in his critique of the Judeo-Christian ethic. But I think Nietzsche probably got his timing a little wrong. I don't think the problem when we have this issue of morality and challenging power hierarchies through morality was simply something that came about in the last 2,000 years. I actually think it goes back much further. And it goes back to probably our early human ancestors. And it goes back to what language is there to do. So if you think about what your early primate ancestors, how they organized themselves, it was almost all through physical coercion. And we can see this if you look at all other ape species. They typically, with one notable exception, they all typically organize themselves in these alpha hierarchies. And basically, social order is sustained through brute coercion. There's somebody who has the most power, who's at the top of the hierarchy, and then everyone else sort of moves down the pecking order. And there's always a lot of contestation there. You always have different betas trying to move up the hierarchy, and there's typically always challenges to the alphas. And the alphas basically secure their, prerogatives around food, around breeding, around any kind of resource based on their coercion. And it's likely that early hominid and early human societies probably organized themselves this way. And the reason we know this is typically if you look at asymmetries in body size between males and females, that typically correlates pretty strongly when you have alpha hierarchy. And if you look at the asymmetries in our population, it suggests that we have, insofar as that we have this natural tendency, we probably have a natural tendency to organizing ourselves relative to alpha hierarchies. The anthropological, I mean, there's a big contestation about this, because when you say hierarchies, of course, people want to bring in their own ideological conditions, and they want to say, oh, we're all free and equal. And one way they do this is talking about bonobos. Does anybody know about bonobos? So bonobos are a species of apes that are close cousins to both us and chimpanzees, and they're in a very particular area of Africa. They're in their own ecological niche. And bonobos seem to fly in the face of primate alpha hierarchies. Bonobos are matriarchal in their power organizations, whereas chimpanzees adjudicate all issues of sex with power and violence. Bonobos adjudicate issues of power and violence with sex. They're basically just humping each other wildly. And that's their method of sort of social bonding and social organization. They are pretty much an exception, though. I think if you look across most animal species, and if you look at the human fossil record, we see much more this tendency towards a default towards kind of power hierarchies. I mean, think about your high school. Just think about how your high school was organized. There are always the popular kids. There are always the nerds. There's always a power hierarchy. You cannot look at almost any human social organization where some sort of power hierarchy does not inevitably rear itself up. We are a species that wants to order itself relative to positions of power. The question is how much are we still dominated by that? I still think we have these inclinations, but a lot of that has been subverted, and what subverted it was language. Because think about what language allows us to do is make rules. In the absence of language, you can't really make a rule. You have, everything is just determined by the moment at hand and by the physical dominance of the moment at hand. When we get language, we're able to sort of say, okay, let's not do certain things. Say you're the tribe and somebody gets sick by eating a red fruit over there. And we begin to notice, red fruit, we have words, red fruit, sick. Let's not eat red fruits that maybe make us sick. And so people know not to eat the red fruits. And then over time, maybe that gets ensconced as a law, thou shalt not eat red fruits, as a way of protecting the tribe and going forward. And then people just go over generation after generation knowing that, we shall not eat red fruits, without ever questioning why, until some kind of free thinker comes along and says, hey, but what about the yummy apples over there? And this is how culture evolves over time. We establish rules, typically for some functional purpose, but these rules oftentimes tend to be very, very sticky, and they tend to stay with us, and sometimes they outlive their functional purpose. Now, the rules that I think are most interesting for us in terms of our own self-process have to do around sexual politics. So if you go back to sort of the alpha hierarchies, one of the primary things that the alpha hierarchies are doing are regulating a reproductive economy. If you think in most primate species, the number of reproductive opportunities for females is limited. The number of potential reproductive opportunities for males, on the other hand, is largely unlimited. And so there's a big asymmetry there in the reproductive economy. And that reproductive economy gets regulated through physical coercion, basically the alpha males dominating in terms of their reproductive prerogatives. What we also know about chimpanzees is that they oftentimes sneak around the back of the alpha males. It's all very, very complicated. It's not quite so simple. But sexuality is basically something that's regulated by physical coercion. Once we have laws and once we have rules, we can begin to regulate sexuality relative to our own demands. It's not simply about power, it can be about sin. So, think about what the Ten Commandments are here. The Ten Commandments are a regime of behavior. They're a regime of rules for us. And, if you think about what the first 4 commandments, it's kind of like they're saying, these are our laws, don't question them. This is the regime that you're living under. And it's a sin to not live under this regime. But then look at the rest of the commandments. You don't want to hurt somebody. You don't want to steal their stuff. You don't want to not covet. That basically means coveting someone's wife. 2 of them, no adultery. It's about sexuality and regulating sexuality here. And so this then generally comes to this question of morality. Morality is about regulation. It's about trying to regulate our own behavior in the absence of physical domination and coercion. And most importantly, morality does this by getting us to regulate ourselves. It's one thing to have the Ten Commandments up and put it up in every classroom or something, But in order for those rules to work, we can't simply spend all of our time policing each other. It's too costly. It's too inefficient. For morality to be really effective, we need to begin to police ourselves. We need to be able to figure out some way of reordering our self-processes so that the rules that we're collectively generating here are going to be something that sticks within us. And the person who pointed this out was the person you read this week, which was Sigmund Freud. Now, I'm going to spend a lot more time next week talking about Freud in more detail in terms of his biography, because it's actually pretty important for understanding his theories. But I just want to say, Freud is oftentimes seen today as a problematic thinker, and there's a lot of problematic aspects of his theories. He's not really widely embraced in academic psychology anymore. If you see Freudians, they're going to be more in the humanities, and I'll tell next week why that's the case. But we shouldn't underestimate Freud. He has fundamentally changed the ways we think about ourselves. If you think that you have an unconscious, if you think that you do things for unconscious reasons, if you ever consider someone repressed, these are all ideas that stem back to Freud. He fundamentally, I think more than anyone else, changed how we think about ourselves in the 20th century. The impact of this thinker is just phenomenal. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to sign his book is because he's made such a big contribution, and Civilizations and Its Discontents is such a terrific book in a lot of ways, and it has a really interesting argument. And Freud starts with this idea of the oceanic feeling. So he challenges us with this idea, okay, there's this oceanic feeling that's out there that we sometimes get a hold of. It connects us to this broader energy source. It seems wonderful, it seems amazing. And why are we not experiencing this oceanic feeling all the time? What is it that's keeping us from living into, as I would say earlier in the quarter, this effervescent birthright that looms within us, that's just below our ordinary consciousness? And instead of experiencing this all the time, we suffer. And why is it that Freud says that we suffer? Well, there are a couple of reasons. There's a body that's causing us to suffer. In this way, as we'll see, he's a lot like Buddhism. There's a body that's degenerating, that has diseases, that causes us pain. So we're trapped in this mortal vessel that is flawed in many, many ways. There's also desire within us. We want so much. We want to constantly feel good. We want all of these different ways to try to manipulate our emotions. And we can never quite always be satisfied, at least for the long haul. We're always in this churning, wanting more, wanting something different, not wanting to be where I am at, wanting to be somewhere better, wanting to be experiencing some greater high. But most importantly, he says the big source of our suffering are each other. And this is our greatest source of suffering. Sure, our bodies degenerate. Sure, we have unsatisfied desires. But Freud says what really gets us is other people. And it goes back to both how we are when we are born and our current circumstance of living in civilization. Now, Freud says when we are born, we are basically just a wellspring of instinctual desires. He called this part of the psyche the id, or das Ich, which actually translates as it. It's this animalistic base craving of just sensual pleasure and desire. What we were talking about earlier in terms of the animal self. It's just the pure animal self. And what does the id want? It just wants pleasure. And Freud called this the pleasure principle. It's the motivation for all of our early behavior. We want our mother's breasts. We want to be held by our mother or our parents. We want sensual pleasure. And that's all we know. As a child begins to develop and as it begins to grow, it encounters reality. The world does not just exist to meet our pleasures. And Freud called this the reality principle. And so the question for the infant is, how does it negotiate between its own desires and the world around it? And that's where the ego begins to develop. So as a child begins to encounter the world and encounter frustrations, they begin to develop a sense of themselves in relationship to those frustrations. The child is being socialized and encountering reality in the form of civilization primarily. We don't live in the wild, we live in settlements. And so reality is presented to the child in terms of the rules and norms of civilization. And what does civilization require? Well, Freud says it has three elements to it. There is cleanliness. Civilization needs to be clean. There's beauty. Civilization creates notions of beauty in our mind. And of course, then there's order. Civilization directs and orders our behavior. And this then becomes the wellspring of our discontent, because what the child needs to do is figure out a way to accommodate the demands of civilization in terms of their own instinctual desires. And this requires a whole lot of psychological configuration. And for Freud, this typically starts with lessons around the potty. At the same time that a child is learning language, a child is learning to control themselves. Now, Freud didn't really focus on language so much. He did focus on this self-control. And he said the first stage of this development was called the anal stage, where children are basically learning to control their bowel movements. And this kind of self-control, this regulation of one's own animalistic properties, is the development of an ego, where the sense of me comes from. This ego attachment, this sense of identity, is happening when we learn to follow rules and not crap all over the place. And that's kind of the first dictate of civilization. We become from these nasty little brutes to being civilized. And you can see this in childhood behavior. So, take for example this. Have you guys seen this like marshmallow test, the candy test? Yeah. So, you put candies in front of these children, and typically, and then you say you're going to leave the room, and you see how long they're going to be until they can resist. And supposedly this is a big predictor of their success in later life. Evidence on that is not so clear. So here we see the two little boys here. Don't eat them yet. The candies are there. They're looking at them. And this is what Freud's talking about here. How do we regulate ourselves in the absence of any kind of control? And then the two of them say, well, should we do it? Should we do it? Of course! And then they're like, yay! And they're just so adorable. It just kills me. But of course, it's not always so cute. A lot of times it's like this. And in fact, it's probably more often like this. We are savage little beasts. And this is what Freud wants to tell us. He says that we, in fact, have all of this wellspring of desires that's selfish, that's aggressive, that's hostile. This is our life force. This is the energy that's within us. It's a species that wants to go out and make dominance in the world. It's very similar to what Nietzsche is saying here. And he says this is what puts Eros and civilization in conflict. And when he describes Eros, what he's really talking about is our vitality, this energy, this life force that's within us. And what civilization needs to do, and as he describes in the book, civilization needs to put Eros in check. It needs to restrain it because it's incompatible with the collective goods of the group. Nudity, for example. We don't walk around naked. Why? Well, it goes back to what I was saying last week, about the Greek statues. We want to emphasize order. We want to sort of de-animalize ourselves. We want to cover ourselves. Why do we want to cover ourselves? We don't want to sort of visibly display our own arousal. We want to keep that hidden. We want to keep that in check. But think about, typically those cultures that have strong ideas about nudity typically have a lot more strong rules and regulations about sexuality as well. Those two things tend to be correlated. I mean, consider the idea of condemnation of masturbation. Why is masturbation a sin? It's something that you're doing for yourself. It's about regulating your own sexual desire, denying your own sexuality here. And this is what leads us to Freud, where he's saying that men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved. They are beasts. This is what Freud's saying. Within us is this, it's an animalistic self. And last week I was describing the animalistic self as a glorious symphony. Yes, it's that. But it's also this fierce creature. It's an undomesticated part of ourselves. It's the wild, feral nature within us. It's the life force that wants to go out and propagate and dominate and take and just sustain itself in relationship, above and beyond everything else. It's our neighbors who are the target of our aggression. And this is where Freud makes one of his most controversial claims. He basically says our nature is not to be loving. That is something that we are taught. Our nature is to be fierce and aggressive. And as a parent to two children and having them raise them through toddlerhood, I can attest that he's got a point. Kids, when they're toddlers, they're nasty, mean little beasts. They're super aggressive. They're super selfish. They're super dominating. That's their animal nature. And what we are trying to do every time we say, no, no, don't hit your brother. No, no, don't play with your penis. You know, all of those types of things, we are trying to de-animalize them. And we're trying to inculcate rules into them. And so this is where we go. So once again, if we think about where the cellular self is resisting entropy, we've got an animal self building upon this that's sort of making maps and predictions about the world. And we have a linguistic self that's not only adding kind of labels and probabilities, it's adding rules. It's reordering how we go about thinking about the world, and it's reordering them at the deepest layers of ourself. And what this basically means, according to Freud, and this is a kind of a provocative and oftentimes troubling idea, is that we are basically repressed beings. If you look into your nature, your authentic self, the authentic energies that are within you, are incompatible with the demands of civilization, are incompatible with living in a civilized society. You have to figure out a way, or we all have had to figure out a way of repressing those. And you know, you could take a civilization like ours. I mean, all of us here, and I've said this before, are super repressed. What it requires for us to be here, what it requires for all of you to be students here, for me to be in front of you, is an enormous amount of instinctual repression. Think about all the times, oh, I'm too tired to study, gotta study. Think about, oh, I'd rather be doing something else. No, I'm gonna focus on this. I've gotta do this job, I've gotta do this work, I've gotta make this achievement. All of this comes, in Freud's mind, from being repressed. And how does that work? Freud says basically we take our natural aggressions that are welling up within us and we redirect them towards ourselves. We become the police of our own selves. So in his idea, it starts with the Oedipal drama. We see our parental authority and we resist it, but we're terrified of our parental authority too. So yes, I have anger towards my parents, but I don't know what to do with it, because if I lash out at them, it could be big trouble. So what he basically suggests that we do is we take all of these energies and we redirect them toward ourselves, and this takes the form of a neurosis. And as I mentioned before, a neurosis is an emotion that's basically inappropriate to its current circumstance. So I'm there and I'm a kid and I've got the marshmallow, the candies in front of me, and my circumstance is eat those. And a neurosis is, I'm anxious about this. What if I do the wrong thing? How am I knowing I'm going to do the right thing? It's not a source of anxiety. You just sort of make an evaluation. What's going to happen if I eat these? Maybe it'll be good, maybe it'll be bad. What neurosis is about generating a whole suite of emotions that are not necessarily relevant to that. And what Freud basically says in Civilization and Its Discontents, civilization operates by making us really neurotic. It takes certain kinds of emotions, like for example, guilt. It makes us continually feel this sense of self-punishment. We could see this really clearly, and I think Nietzsche would embrace this in the Judeo-Christian ethic. You know, the idea that we are all born into original sin. Or that, you know, Christ died on the cross to atone for us. I mean, talk about passive-aggressive behavior. Like, wow, that's just a heavy amount of guilt and burden. I see this a lot with students who are here, and some of you may be this, where you're the first generation to come to college, or your parents migrated to the United States, and they did all this to provide you a better life. God, the guilt that you carry around that. You're now suddenly the vessel of somebody else's ambitions, and all the sacrifices they made on your behalf. What guilt does, it makes us continually punish and berate ourselves for not being good enough, for not being worthy enough, for thinking that we owe something to somebody else. So that's one of the major emotions that comes through. Anxiety. If, you know, money is the machine of sort of war, anxiety is the machine of the University of Chicago. I mean, this place is the center of anxiety. It's not just here, it's all top universities. This is the engine that drives us here. It's always anxiety. And what is anxiety really? It's this ongoing apprehension about something that's going to happen in the future without knowing exactly what it is. So I saw this yesterday. My son got a really bad report card in on his biology, for the first semester of his biology. And I was upset about that, but mostly I'm anxious. I'm like, oh God, his future's ruined now. What's going to happen? You know, and it was irrational, but I'm feeling all of this anxiety on his behalf. And it's completely inappropriate to the moment at hand. But we dwell in this emotional state. And it's this fear of what some possible sort of catastrophic outcome. And what anxiety really is, and I'm going to talk more about this next week, it's about these narratives that we use to keep ourselves in line. These narratives that we begin to spin out. When we experience guilt, when we experience anxiety, how we typically rationalize and understand those emotions is in terms of these stories that then get generated within our heads. And of course, this isn't the only thing. There's also depression. There's another form of neurosis. And what depression basically is this experience of being injured when you're actually not feeling any kind of harm. When your body gets injured, you want to sort of curl yourself up, you want to get into a ball, you want to take rest, you want to protect yourself from the world, you want to withdraw in, you demotivate yourself in terms of your behaviors. This is oftentimes what depression is. And the other thing about depression is it usually involves a lot of feelings of pain. What we don't really appreciate is when most people are depressed, at least at some subconscious level, they are experiencing actually an enormous amount of physical pain. And that's what's triggering all the depressive symptoms within that. And this is yet another way that civilization begins to shape and affect us. So where does this leave us? Because here we have one of the great minds of the past 150 years basically telling us that we're kind of doomed. Now, granted, Freud, when he was writing this book, this was the last book he wrote. He had, esophageal and jaw cancer. He had just fled from the Nazis. He was dying. He was in a lot of pain. He was in a pretty dark place in his own life. But the book is pretty dark in terms of like what its understanding of the human condition is all about. He basically says we are doomed as a consequence. And I would say a question as the linguistic self here, are we really doomed to this condition of always being neurotic, always having these inappropriate emotions, always feeling in states of pain? In order for us to address this problem and think about this problem, we've got to begin to know our own selves. We've got to be able to understand our own self-process. In what ways do guilt and anxiety, for example, manifest themselves in our own ordering process? And I would rephrase this when we start thinking about this in terms of how do we reconcile our inner needs with our outer circumstances? And I think our big problem is that we oftentimes do this very inefficiently. And I go back to this notion that I was saying earlier in the class about, what the self is trying to do is balance between order and vitality. At the cellular level, you're doing this in terms of DNA structure and metabolism. At the animal level, in terms of your ecology, and then balancing the vitality and order of all of your multicellular elements coming together. And at the linguistic level here, what does it mean to balance order and vitality? What are the rules that we are internalizing? What are the rules that we're taking on in terms of shaping ourselves? How can we begin to take responsibility for using those rules? How can we find a way of being a little more balanced? And so in order to answer those questions, we're going to have to do one more thing. Before we kind of go into this track of transcendence, we need to look at one more key element that is an outgrowth of the linguistic self, and this is the egoistic self. We need to then find out who exactly it is we are, not just as an ordered species by language, but as individuals. What are our individual life stories? Where are these coming from? How are these encapsulating all of these processes that Freud was talking about? So next week, we'll start talking about the egoistic self.